In this sub-lesson, we're going to take apart the laptop and get at the display. We have to remove the bezel to do this. This can get a little bit hairy when you're working on laptops, so you got to be patient and just take it step by step. Let's begin. Every laptop's different, and some are easier to take apart than others. For this particular laptop, we've got these little pads which cover the screws. So you kind of have to pull those off, and then you can unscrew each of these, and then you can take the entire bezel off, and then you'll be able to unscrew the monitor from there. Now I've covered the actual display with paper just in case, because if you're using a screwdriver, you don't want to go up against this display by mistake. So a little extra protection there. Put some regular 8.5 by 11 paper on there. And you'll find that it usually sticks right to the screen because of static, but you could tape it on if you have to. And be careful when you're removing the bezel. You might have a webcam or something like that, so you want to be careful to pull everything away at the same time. The webcam may connect with a little flex connector, so you want to watch for that kind of thing. Remember, when opening a laptop, you have to employ anti-static methods. Very important. Use that anti-static strap. And if you're working with any equipment like hard drives or RAM, make sure you keep those inside of an anti-static bag until you're ready to install them. Also, you may want to use an anti-static mat. However, in this case, there's not going to be anywhere for you to connect the alligator clip from that anti-static mat. So you're going to need another source, another grounding source to connect to. And a computer case would be fine for that. If you have one that's open, just make sure that you're connecting to the chassis. So make sure you employ anti-static methods when working on the laptop. Okay, so here's another laptop, and we've taken the bezel off here. And once you do, you can actually remove the display if necessary. And you've got some screws here that have to be removed and some connections. Now, before you do any of that, you want to make sure that you have your anti-static strap. And there's two reasons for that. One, you want to protect, just in case you touch a circuit board, you want to protect those circuit boards, and you don't want to discharge to them. But two, if you're working with the power connections for a display or the inverter, then you want to make sure that you have something like this. One, it'll provide a path to ground for any electricity. And two, these devices, these anti-static straps often have a 1 mega ohm resistor. So that can help protect you against any type of spike or shock. So anyways, to remove these, you have to remove all the screws, obviously. And then we have the data connection for the display, and that's here. It's a flex connector. We can pull that out with this. Try to pull it out evenly, and that pulled that out right there. Okay, and you can see the connector. This is one of the most common culprits for no display, and it's the video connector's loose or damaged. And that happens. It could creep out because the humidity changed real quick, or pressure changes. Let's say the laptop was taken on a plane, or it was in some type of other transit. So that could come loose a little bit. I've fixed this 3 or 4 times in the past year for people, and I'm not a laptop tech. That's not what I do right now. But, I'll get various people saying, hey, my laptop's not working, the display isn't doing anything, but it sounds like it's running. And it's like, well, the first thing I'm going to check is this guy. And this could be here underneath the keyboard, or it could be in underneath the bezel, in a different circuit board. Depends on the laptop. Quite often it's under here. So you have to disconnect that data connection, but also the power connection. And this uses a black wire and a white wire, and these actually pull apart. And so you want to pull apart the black wire first. And again, make sure that you have some type of path to ground and that 1 mega ohm resistor, and then pull the white wire apart. And then you'll pull those out of here and pull the whole display out. Now, what could go wrong with the displays? There's a couple things that could go wrong. First of all, the video adapter could fail. If you have a separate video adapter, you can replace that. But in a lot of cases, it'll be integrated to the CPU. The GPU processing will be integrated to the CPU, so that CPU will have to be replaced, or the entire CPU and motherboard will have to be replaced. So that's, that makes it more difficult. In other cases, it could be a mini PCI Express card that's controlling video. There's a couple different options there. But if that happens, if that video adapter goes bad, you will be able to tell because you won't get anything on your main display, and you also won't get anything on an external display quite often if you have one connected via HDMI or something. Now, let's say you see nothing on this display, but the external display does work. Well, then that means a couple other things could have gone wrong. The display itself could have failed, which honestly, I don't see that as much anymore. I don't see it as often as I did 5 or 10 years ago. Another possibility is the inverter failed, or the power circuit board that these power connections go to has failed. How do you know the difference between the two? Well, if the display fails, you will get nothing. You will be able to see nothing on the display at all. If the inverter fails, and this changes the voltage in here so that the display can register properly. If that fails, you might see a very dim display. Or if you can't, you could still try to see it by taking the laptop into a dark room and flashing a flashlight against it while the system's running. If you can see Windows or whatever other operating system on here very dimly with the flashlight, because that'll reflect back off of the display and show you what's happening. If you can see that, then you know the display's okay, and it's either the inverter has failed or something else has failed in here power-wise, probably the inverter. On this particular device, the inverter could be replaced separately. On other laptops, it has to be replaced by removing the whole display anyway, so it all depends on the laptop. So what are the things that could fail? Once again, the video adapter itself could fail, which could be integrated to the motherboard or to the CPU. But the most common thing that I see is that flex connector. You've got to make sure that that is connected real solid and tight. Make sure everything's flat. And check that wire too. Make sure it's in its wire guide so that it doesn't get damaged. So when you put everything back together, everything's nice and flat. Again, in addition, the display itself could fail, in which case it has to be replaced, or the inverter could fail, and in some cases that could be replaced separately. Got to be very careful with the inverter. In some cases, you connect those with a screw and they're housed in a metal housing here. But in other cases, the inverter is just a card, and you have to actually replace the card by itself. You want to be real careful not to touch anything on that device, especially when removing it. So that's a possibility as well without having to remove the display. And you might have a problem with the power connection. Maybe that's loose. Or the circuit board that the power connections go to might have to be swapped out. That's usually just a screw or two and a power connector. And then there's the lid switch. Every laptop has a lid switch which tells the system to shut off when it's closed, shut off the power to the display when it's closed, and turn on the power to the display when it's open. And sometimes that'll fail. When you open the laptop, you get nothing on the display, so you can check the lid switch as well. Here's an example of lid switches. And this is a really powerful system. This is a really tough system right here. You can see that's a pretty powerful mechanism. Chances of that failing are slim to none, but it could. And so you have to check that. Maybe it's stuck, or maybe the switch needs to be replaced. And sometimes you'll see this referred to as the LCD lid switch. And it could just be a little button. It could be a little tiny button in the corner that is depressed when this closes. And this is a much more powerful version of that, but it all depends on the laptop. It could even be activated in a magnetic way. So it all depends on which laptop you have. So check the LCD switch. Make sure that's functioning properly, whether it's down here in the corner or whether it's up here. And make sure that's actually working right. That could be the culprit as well. You might have to go onto the motherboard and reconnect the connector for that. So that's another possibility. Let's take a look at one more laptop and talk about the bezel. Now, sometimes you have a really thin bezel, and it can be very difficult to get that off. And sometimes you have to actually pry it from the back in between the two pieces of plastic. Sometimes you have to disconnect something here from the right here from the hinge. Sometimes you have to pry in from a certain area where there's an opening and then start moving around very slowly. And you want the thinnest shim you could possibly get that's either wood or plastic so you don't damage this. You might even use a credit card or something else like that. It can be very difficult to remove these bezels when they're this thin, especially if you have a MacBook Air or something like that. And it's really recommended that you just take those to an authorized repair center. So in some cases, you don't actually even have any screws. You just have a bezel that has to be removed in order to get to that display or get to that inverter. So you got to be real careful with that. Sometimes the connection, the power connection, and the data connection, which goes through here, can get damaged just from use, just from opening and closing and, usage of the hinge. So sometimes that has to be replaced as well. Not the hinge, but the power cable and or the data connection. So be real careful when you're working with these bezels. Make sure that you use a very thin shim and just work it one little bit at a time. You're gonna have to find that opening, and it's gonna be different from one laptop to the next. And honestly, the displays don't go bad as often, especially now we're moving past LCD. We're getting into LED LCDs and OLEDs, and all these displays, they last longer. They don't fail as much. You don't get any bad pixels anymore. So that kind of stuff's a thing of the past, really. So unless it's damaged, and that's why you gotta be real careful with these displays. So that's about it for displays.